In this lecture, I am going to present the historical context of John Steinbeck's novel. This is a novel where it really helps to know the background of the 1930s, the Great Depression's effect on migrant workers and farmers, as well as the Dust Bowl that happened out west. And this presentation is a little dated. I actually made this PowerPoint when I was teaching in 2007. And there are going to be some missing details that we now have clarity on as we deal with our own pandemic. Let's remember that the first flu influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 has an effect on America, but because we were in World War I, and because we didn't have as much of a scientific understanding of viruses then, the effects of the first pandemic kind of get overlooked. And it's never in the front page of the news because we're so focused on World War I. And then we have the Roaring 20s as the economy comes back in the 1920s. And then the Great Depression happens. And then we're building up to World War II. So it's kind of like in history. It's weird how this major event happens, but we didn't really talk about it until we went through our own pandemic. I may talk about that in this lecture. Anyways, I want you to think about how many times your families have moved, because when we are relating to these characters in the beginning of the story, they are itinerant. That means they have to travel a lot, and they don't have roots. They don't have a sense of place or home since they have to travel for work as farmers. In the 2007, we went through our own recession in the Midwest, especially Michigan, because of the auto industry's changes, and that caused a recession for Michigan before a home crisis recession in 2000 and I guess I'd say 8 to 2012. So this motif of friendship is really important in the book, not just the economy. And we have George and Lenny, and they are friends. George is like a caretaker for Lenny, even though they're not brothers. And the book's going to reveal why George feels so responsible for this person that he grew up with. And I want you to think about this quote from Ann Richards. I've always said that in politics, your enemies can't hurt you, but your friends will kill you. This is metaphorical. The things that we do for our friends can really take a lot of time. It can change us. So just have that quote in mind as we read the book. Here's another quote about friendship from David Hume. Truth springs from the arguments among friends. Isn't that true? Don't we reveal our true ideas when we argue with our friends, the people we care about most? Sometimes we are the meanest to our friends because we're so comfortable with them. C.S. Lewis said, friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." And Norman Douglas said, to find a friend, one must close one eye. To keep him, you need to close two. I love this idea, metaphorically, how we must look past our friends' faults to remain friends, and they must do the same for us. So this migrant experience is a powerful plot point to give us empathy. Why are we reading Of Mice and Men when it was published so many decades ago? Why is it classic literature? Because it captures something about America that I think is important to realize. These migrant workers' experience can teach us something about our own time. Now, the farms were struggling because after World War I, there was a major drop in the price of how they could sell their crops. And a lot of farmers had spent a lot of money on improving their technology, but then the price crops were dropping and they weren't making as much money. And a lot of them are defaulting on their loans or their mortgages. And it was a huge problem. And then the stock market crashes. And this not only hurt New York City when we think of those famous photographs of bread lines. I mean, this affects everybody in the country and the world. Many independent farmers are losing their farms. Agricultural workers are frustrated during the 30% unemployment rates. And this kind of is a leading up to a great traveling of people out to California to find new work, to find new jobs on farms. The Dust Bowl happens, and we have a 7-year drought starting in 1931. And I want to share a picture about that Dust Bowl. It's unimaginable. It's not imaginable to realize that effect of climate that they were experiencing in the Dust Bowl, and that dryness, that drought that creates this huge dust storms. This is the type of dust that will creep in between the cracks of the windows and the doors. You can't get away from it. and the families are left to leave their farms. When the dust settled, what would you have done? Would you have left your farm to go to California? A lot of Oklahoma does. And why California? Well, the mild climates do create a lot of long growing seasons. The mild climates do create different harvest cycles, but the popular songs and stories exaggerates California's promise, as it does now. California is one of the most populated states in the country, and we think about LA, it's the city of angels, offers a lot of opportunities, but there are a lot of people who live in poverty too. The advertising that would have happened in flyers were trying to get workers to travel to California, and they would get there after traveling on Highway 66. It's almost like the highways are a directional arrow getting people out there, and 20% of migration came from Oklahoma alone. I don't think it was kind of people to call them Okies, but people often felt like the people traveling to California were hurting their state, not just helping it. Because what happens is when all these workers traveled to Oklahoma, from Oklahoma to California and other states as well, prices of salaries dropped. The paychecks for the farmers, there were so many workers that a lot of employers were able to lower their rates. So the effects of the Great Depression are effect on everybody, and California is not the promised land expected. Some people are turned away at the borders. There's discrimination and stereotypical attitudes treated toward these migrant workers. And when we think about these famous photography, we are lucky to have this document of the experience of people traveling to California to find work. Mexican migrants often felt the challenges just like other people in the country traveling with nothing but what they can carry on their back, like George and Lenny. Steinbeck found inspiration in this experience as he grew up in California and documented it in his novels. We think about these farmers, if they were lucky enough to have cars and trucks. These aren't the type of cars and trucks that we rely on that get 150,000 miles before they wear out, or 200,000 miles. And some people weren't lucky enough to have a way to travel in caravans. They had to ask for help, or they even hitchhiked. The children of this experience are documented in the photography as they have lunch on the road and leave their homes behind. The migrant experience was documented by a famous photographer, Dorothea Lange, and a lot of these photographs are in museums, capturing what it was like to struggle on the road. And then there's no guarantee for work when you get there. However, many do find a way to build a new life in California. Now, the Salinas Valley is where John Steinbeck often sets the setting of his stories. Where George and Lenny are coming from is up top here in Weed. This town they have to flee, and they talk about why they have to leave so abruptly in chapter 1. And they're getting all the way to a farm in Soledad by the Salinas Valley. Look at this trip they had to take by bus. And the bus driver does what to George and Lenny? Lies to them. There's 4 miles they have to hike to get to the farm. So here's where the ranch is probably located on a map. Fictional, but it feels real. Now, thrashing machines, bucking grain, cultivators, these are all terms that they would have used in the farms, and the type of machinery they would be using. This is manual labor that respectably these men are doing. I don't mean to ignore the women, but this is a time period where men are going to do the manual labor in America's farms, and the women are going to do the domestic labor. So if we think about the life on the ranch, I've often said this in class, but remember, these men are migrant itinerant workers. They're building friendships quickly, acquaintanceships, but they often are isolated and guarded. They're emotionally cut off from other people. Sometimes we might not trust the person sharing the bunk next to us. Sometimes we'll meet someone like Slim, a rancher who will be described in Of Mice and Men, who is immediately respected, a trustworthy character. George and Lenny are lucky they travel together, and while Lenny can be a burden at times, George is lucky to have that close hometown friendship as well. Steinbeck will use a description of imagery constantly in this book, from the rabbits to the trees to the dogs. And his use of description is part of his style. I love this part of his reading. It's very accessible, though. It's not like reading Shakespeare. It's not like reading the Odyssey. It's got its own style that really was popular in his time period. I mean, this is a writer who captured America's attention. He won the Nobel Peace Prize and met the president. He was well respected. To be bold is to be lonely. Steinbeck wrote that his old friends did not want him, partly because of his works and partly because he was so successful. This isn't my country anymore, he said, and it won't be until I am dead. It makes me very sad. He left a lot of his hometowns. He knew what it was like to have to move. And Steinbeck was probably also difficult to deal with. I'm not going to talk about his biography in this lecture, but we will talk about it in class. He was divorced 3 times. Married 3 times. And there are stories shared from his previous wives that reveal a little bit of his arrogance, maybe even his misogynistic nature. The way he treated women in his stories is something we should discuss. He wasn't a perfect writer by any stretch of the means, and there probably was no perfect writer ever, right? Now, 1956, he wrote, "Don't think for a moment that you will ever be forgiven for being what they call different. You won't. I still have not been forgiven. Only when I am delivered in a pine box," basically his death, "will I be considered safe." And what he means is his ideas, his works, his books challenged America. Sometimes they were banned, but they were well sold, and they are well respected now because the way he captured characters was unique and well done. And he's now part of the canon. At one time, he was not a book that we assigned in classrooms. He was sold off the shelves of bookstores across America. People couldn't wait for his next book to come out. And I'm hoping you have that experience too. So we're thinking about the 1930s. We're thinking about these traveling workers. We're thinking about the Dust Bowl. We're thinking about a time of the Great Depression that hopefully we are able to empathize and maybe even escape in our own time right now. And as I do this lecture, we are struggling through a pandemic. There is no generation that has inspired us more than your own. You are a beacon of hope. And I hope this book provides not just a chance to challenge your reading and writing, but escape from the regular sense of the day like reading can be. It can be entertainment. Get caught up in these characters. George and Letty will meet Candy, the old swamper, early in chapter 2. We'll meet the boss and the boss's son, Curly. We'll meet Curly's wife, who's never given a name. We'll talk about that. We'll meet Carlson, a foil to some of these characters, like Slim, the well-respected rancher. And there aren't a lot of characters in the book. George and Letty will become the most memorable, who are often elusively referenced in Family Guy, The Simpsons, and famous movies across the country that we still watch and read today. Thanks.